All right, welcome everyone to Stig People on October 22. Brad, to you.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm just going to do a quick overview and then to give you a sense of the progress here or how things are going to play out. And then we're going to hand off to Daniel, Bleu, Ronen, Shahar, and back to me. And then we're going to open it up to some inquiries and discussion. I'll screen share here. And so might as well do present. Can you do that? Yeah, so there's our conversation.
Looks good.
Gall's law seems to be very popular these days, so it's almost like we just need to say number 42, right? Gall's law. Most everybody knows how about Stigmergy at this point, but I learned about it mostly through Daniel and his work and the active inference people, sorry. But it's, sorry. But it's all about marking the environment so that collective behaviors can result from those. And Daniel might be able to elaborate a little bit better on that. The notion of Stigmergy kind of requires a landscape where the marks are left. Ants mark the ground that they're on. In some of our discussion here, the social bookmarking landscape is URLs. And the Stig people landscape is humans. That's the core concept behind what we're going to talk about, is really humans marking humans. And we're sort of thinking of it as, A marks B, where a mark is a verb, and then you might have modifiers. This is all open to discussion, of course, but what does it mean to mark each other in meaningful ways? One way we're thinking about this, let me get this out of the way. I've really enjoyed working with the common sense makers, people who you're going to meet momentarily. And that started with figuring out how to collaborate in the social bookmarking landscape, because I've done a lot of Twitter crawling, and I thought I could contribute there. But I sort of think of, and Renan will talk about Stigmergic marking in that space, but in that I kind of differentiate the content landscape where you're marking URLs, and the human part of it is part of it, but it's not it's almost implicit or ancillary. And then the human landscape is actually just marking people. And so we can kind of, I sort of think of social bookmarking as what at that landscape, open source attention. And in the human landscape, we can mark each other and collections come out of that. And then, did I skip one here? Oh yeah, so we have marking tools. What are those marking tools? Twitter, Slack, Discord. So in Twitter, maybe you tweet a URL, or and that becomes a mark on that URL. You might retweet someone in the process, and that becomes a mark in the human landscape. And then we're thinking about, Discord, Slack bots, where you can mark people mark each other. And the DAO Gardens, which you'll hear about, is about marking URLs from Discord. And then what comes out of those two landscapes is lots of opportunity for innovation. In the open innovation world, it's like, what kind of curation, sense making, publishing, token economics can we build around on top of this open source attention corpus? On the human side, what kind of people discovery, collective decision making, tokenomics, et cetera, can we derive from this kind of open data, as Andy calls it, a Galmia, so an open data shared resource. And then kind of both of them have an opportunity to kind of, develop your own algorithms on top of those. And so for the rest of the meeting, what we're going to do is I'm going to throw to Daniel, and he'll talk about catechisms, which I really have enjoyed kind of digging into as kind of part of the process. And then we'll pass on to Ronen and Shahar, to talk about open source attention. Blue will dig into Stig people and the paper we're considering, and then I'll elaborate a little bit on that, and then we can open it up to inquiries. Most of what inquiries is wide open. One big question is, how do we implement some of this stuff in Web3? What's the language? We can talk about whatever anybody wants to talk about. And then there's a doc. It's in the chat that you can use for collaborative note taking. And I think that's it. So Daniel, back to you.
All right. Thank you for the context, Brad. Thanks everyone for joining. Well, many ways to go second. And on the agenda was to talk about catechisms and about process. So I guess just to catechisms first. When Blue's speaking to the Stig People project, perhaps we can see what a catechism looks like, as the catechism that Blue and others created is comprehensive and useful. But just speaking generally, a catechism is a question and answer format. And in many areas, it has a context of being like dogmatic, memorized, and pedagogical. And so any of those connotations are unintended, because as we're using it here, the catechism is still structured as question and answer. However, rather than being dogmatic and memory oriented, the catechism is a way for a group to find alignment in a project, and also to, as they work together, develop and version their project and increase their accountability to each other and their ability to communicate. So I'll put this link in the note-taking document as well, like under catechisms. But this is a database that our colleague RJ Corday curated with different catechisms. And so people will be able to play around with all of these different question and answer formats, ranging from the simple doing a thing catechism, what is happening and why, all the way on through more comprehensive question and answer structure templates related to innovation and entrepreneurship, or acquiring a grant, designing a game, developing narrative campaigns. And so catechisms have been used in various ways. People can follow that link or with any other questions if they want to like learn more, but it's an example of Stigmergy and collaborating on digital documents to improve the ability for even incipient teams to be able to get it all out there on the page, synthesize and integrate their visions, and just collaborate in a way where we can have a bunch of people having a shared conversation, which is very Kernel-esque indeed. And that's why it's been a useful resonance. Then just on the process note, during this conversation, a lot of threads are probably going to arise. And I'm sure people have so many useful things to add. On one hand, we'll have the recording, which we can consider how to utilize. And also importantly, we'll have the note-taking document with different resources and links out. With that being said,
yeah, I'll pass it on to ronen and shahar in a second. And Blue just linked to one of the catechisms. The reason I liked it is it's a really nice way to kind of get something going. I had never considered writing a paper together, but these people do it all the time. So I said, how do we do that? And they said, write a catechism. So that's what we did. And it's been a fun process. So yeah, ronen and shahar, you want to take over?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks again for inviting us over to your kernel conversations. Yeah, pleasure for us to be here. And yeah, I guess so many of you will probably, I think many of you were at the previous conversation, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. But I'll kind of try to give just a brief overview of sort of where we're thinking Yeah, I really like the distinction that Brad is making about like the content landscape and the people landscape is like having some similarities and some differences, and they're both important, and considering them both is important. Yeah, I'll talk about the content landscape just quickly. I'll share a few slides that I whipped up. Just kind of how our thinking on this is evolving over the months since the last meeting. So it's kind of an emerging trend we're seeing where all this talk about decentralized social media, like there's so many protocols coming out, like every day, literally, like you hear about a new one. The Lens protocol, Farcaster, Blue Sky, all these protocols are for social media, decentralized social media. And this is what we were talking about in the sort of the previous conversation. It's about creating media, right? Like freeing content creation and sharing. Our angle is trying to focus on something that it seems like it's actually now an emerging sort of category. We're trying to make a meme of this, that like decentralized social meta media, which is sort of reactions to content. And that's the Stigmergy marker is another framing for that sort of idea of reactions to content. And there are actually a few groups that are kind of going in this direction, which is really cool, and we hope to sort of join forces. Yeah, so we're common sense makers. We're thinking about this, but there are a few other groups that I also want to kind of give a shout out to them. So I think most of these groups, it's interesting also as sort of the sort of basic way you would start with this. Like, so you can ask, okay, what is a reaction to content? It could be a lot of different things. Is it a like? Is it something else? And kind of the basic thing is really sort of this idea of bookmarking, I think, social bookmarking, which Brad mentioned. So different ways to sort of do this kind of decentralized social bookmarking it's kind of a protocol unto itself. You could say it's sort of it's maybe like a slimmer version of social media because they're not actually posting content, but it's an important kind because it's like the reactions to content we talked about. That's one distinction. So social media and meta media. Another distinction I think is kind of useful for this conversation, maybe this idea of sort of closed source attention versus open source attention. This is what happens today on the left, the closed source attention. This is looking at sort of scholarly information environments. So this kind of thing is called an attention score, right? Like the altmetric, if you've any like academics have maybe heard about this. Computing an attention score for some kind of publication. And it's interesting because if you look at some of the data sources for this thing, like many of them are actually like closed. They're like, they were bought by these different publishers, and then they're kind of, all these APIs are, you maybe can pay to use them, or maybe you can pay to see part of them. But the point is they're not really open. So when we say closed source attention, we're talking about this kind of platformized environment where even like science and academic research is being platformized. Open source attention, is how to it's still under construction, right? There are no alternatives, like viable alternatives to this kind of thing that exists, but this is sort of where we want to go, build some kind of viable alternative where this kind of data is much more open and easily accessible. And specifically, maybe just like for the next slide, and I'll finish here. If you look at Mendeley, that's an interesting one, and Cite You Like, because these are actually social bookmarking for scientists. Like these are applications that do social bookmarking for scientists. And that is why we think this is like really important place to start in. It's kind of the basic sort of bread and butter. Everyone has a reference manager when you're doing scientific research. So we're kind of focusing there at the current stage. If you go into this, it's kind of a rabbit hole, like what happened to social bookmarking. But if you look at like these different academic social bookmarking applications and platforms, you can see these orange ones here and this one. They all get snapped up by the big publishers. And all of them are snapped up. Like none are currently open. And then we use this kind of dragon hoarding the Stigmergic markers, because whenever you follow Stigmergic markers, you inevitably find some platform dragon that's hoarding them. Like you don't find, they're never going to be like some kind of open access API. People are starting to pay attention to this. So there's this knowledge. There's this kind of, I think this is an interesting insight, an important one. Open access knowledge is important, but focusing too much on the openness is distracting us from the ways where capital is sneaking in the back door and closing the tools we need to make sense of all the knowledge. So this is kind of going back to the social media and the meta media. Like the meta media is something we need to make sense of this content. So freeing up the social bookmarking is kind of the first stage, and that's what we're working on. And Shahar can tell you more about like some of the concrete efforts we're making at this stage. And happy to take questions. I don't know how you guys want to do this. Like we can do questions after the whole thing or during.
Either way, we have pressing questions, or we can do it when we'll switch to just open conversation after a couple more passes.
Yeah, all right. Hi. So yeah, in light of the common sense protocol settings, where we envision this open source attention corpus, where many applications can come and grow. Many sense making tools can utilize this open source data. So what we went for as a sort of a proof of concept, you can call it, is this what we call DAO gardens. We will probably change the name because it shouldn't be just for DAOs. It should be for like any organization that would like to use it, or even individuals. So yeah, if you have a name, so you can offer it to us. And one way to think about DAO gardens is as a sort of a Zapier. A Zapier which is fine-tuned for collective sense making. And it's kind of like you can select your inputs from different platforms to collect Stigmergy data. Then it can be like like communication tools like Discord, Slack, GitHub, Twitter. And then you can collect things like reactions, comment using NLP, social primitives like invite or follow. And then you select your sort of this aggregation rules, which can be like a simple buzz, maybe like how many reactions are surrounding certain URL or content. You can give semantic meanings to reactions. For example, you can say that a book, if you see like enough books on a post, so maybe you want to do with something afterwards, you can use like more of machine learning methods like PageRank and other things which are more advanced. We're not there at all, but just the idea. And then you select the action or the output of this sort of advanced Zapier, which could be like you want to push content into an RSS feed, into Notion, to tweet it into Twitter, Mirror, Airtable, integrated garden app, which is something that we are working on, and many other options. But basically, this is like you can picture it like that. And this sort of thing, it could be used by organizations or communities to govern their collective attention, to improve wayfinding and content discovery within the organizations, while giving high agency to members to take part in the curation process and recognize their contributions. So yeah, part of that Zapier thing may be like incentive, how you connect incentive or credentials or different badge systems and stuff like that. Another use for it, though, it's for individuals to govern their own attention and aggregate cross-platform communities content and in a personalized manner. You can, configure your settings by your own, like for example, the most simple thing is just, configure what you see that is coming out of Discord. Like imagine that you simply, you can control a feed that comes out of your multiple Discord servers in a simple way, in a personalized way.
Shahar, can you talk a little bit about what you guys have implemented with the Discord proof of concept?
Yeah.
Or show it?
Yeah, definitely. So we're working closely with Gideon here from the TC, and we're running with the TC team a curation service, which is basically a knowledge curation service. And I can show you. All what we've been working on. Wait, is it? Yeah, it's here. You see my you see Discord?
Yep.
Right. Okay, so this is here. This is the TC server, and you can see over here it's a forum called knowledge sharing, And basically any member of the TC can come by and drop some interesting content that they might believe that would be interesting for the TC. And then anyone can come and comment and leave some reactions, etc. So for example, you see here some one post, and it received a lot of attention, for example. So what happens is right now we're working with a very simple rule. It's simply, okay, if a post has more than 5 reactions, more or equal to 5, then it satisfies the rules and we want to keep it. Okay, so what happens is that it's going to our backend over here, and yeah, I won't go over all of the stuff here, but like it gets to this table that is called top messages. And wait, let's let it yeah, okay, and wait, okay, and here you can actually, it's the first message here. So you can see like the entry, you can see like the Stigmergy data we harvested, and then right now what we're working with, like the instance that we're working with the TC, it's immediately synced to Airtable. Okay, so you will see the message over here. Here's we can expand it. It's the same message. You can see all of the reaction counts and everything, and yeah, and it syncs immediately. Like I can show you, but maybe it's like, there's no reason for me to do it. But basically, this is like the Zapier thing, right? We have Discord. We have some bot monitoring Discord. Then content is being pulled to the backend, where there's some sort of an aggregation, and then it outputs to Airtable. The TC wants to utilize it for outreach mainly right now, for like Twitter and maybe newsletters, and maybe Gideon can say more than I, but this is basically what we're working with right now. And like as for for why is it relevant, like to what we're talking about here about Stigmergy. Wait, I will stop sharing. So one way to think about it is that, okay, right now we're kind of, when we set up rules, we can set certain semantics on the reactions, for example, and we can then use this language that we develop for actually marking people. It can be like through content, it could be directly, and by that we can sort of create these trust graphs that we're probably going to talk about in about a second. So this is like something that we can I think utilize quite fast. And like the usage that we can make of it, like there's many cool things I think we can accomplish with that. For example, just like for personalized feeds, for each member of, for example, the TC to have a personalized feed based on the trust graph that he has or she, and also using the trust graph to compute voting weights, like in a liquid democracy, like for the curation process itself, for example. And also like a cool thing that Ronen talked about is like matchmaking. Use the trust graph to recommend matchmaking, and maybe even you use this sort of a Tinder thing to matchmake people in different communities. So yeah.
Yeah, and a little bit of context on that. So what that demo shows to me is a marking mechanism on the content landscape, right? If somebody shares a URL, people mark it with emojis, etc. One of the sort of overarching questions, both for that and for Stig people, is where does that go? Like right now, it goes to Airtable. How do we get it? What's the best way to kind of publish it out to Web3 so that it truly becomes, open source attention. And so yeah, that's a big question. We can talk about that as much as we want. That's one of the inquiries we want to talk about. Yeah, Blue.
Cool, thanks. Okay, I think I'm going to share the catechism at Daniel's prompting, also because I didn't make slides, so we can just look at this. So this is a catechism that was kind of started by Brad, and there's another catechism that's more project centered that I kind of adapted and put into, like, if you're going to write a paper about this, what does it look like? And so this catechism just has, like, what is the nature of the problem that we're going to address? And I think fundamentally, I'm really interested in how do we reduce the information burden of the internet. Like, it's awesome to have endless information, like at the tap of a few buttons, but at the same time, it can be very overwhelming. And even in dealing with other people in a community. So like there's, 440 people in this kernel block. I've maybe met like 200. I maybe remember 20 of those 200. And I'm sure, like, these are all hand selected people who are probably awesome. Am I connecting with the right 20 people? How do I know that? And also, like, this is just this block. So we're block 7, block 6 was empty, but like, you've got to assume that there's 1,000 other people out there or more that were also hand selected, pulled into kernel because they were awesome. So how do we like align with people who would be beneficial to us, to our social network, to our interests, that are just cool people to hang out with, where we have overlapping things in common? So how do we form these bridges, even just with this information burden of all of the people that we are dealing with? So they've already mentioned, Shahar brought up awesomely, the online dating thing. Like, so back in the days before there was internet dating, people would spend like thousands of hours and dollars, like trying to figure out a person, like whether is this person a good match for me, or just find someone that they maybe like line up with. And like, in point of fact, when you have like a profile out there, like Tinder style, here's like my picture and 25 random facts about me, like those 25 random facts could be like deal breakers in like a dating relationship. Like, is this a potential life mate? Like, if this person likes dogs and I like cats, that's never going to work. Or if they smoke, or if they drink, or if their religious or political views aren't the same as mine. And so like, you can get all of that like deal breaker stuff out of a dating profile without having to like softly beat around the bush and then address it. So it's all this like information can be used to pre-screen people so that we form connections with the people that are most beneficial to us. So what we know about each other, and what can be uncovered even like in Slack and Discord from like direct interactions with people, even in conversation, or maybe especially in conversation, is really different than the type of stuff that you can find out about me in LinkedIn, my LinkedIn profile. So these kinds of things, like, can we use like not only the information that's available in the content landscape, and so I think like there's still some we still have to sort out really within our team, like what are explicit and implicit marks. So for me, like the content landscape is anything that can be currently scraped, like including retweets on Twitter, because a lot of that is done by bots. So that's not necessarily like a human interaction. I think for me, like the internet has all of the content landscape, but like humans in the landscape, when you create an intentional mark on a human, like Andy frequently does this in Slack, like, oh, Blue, you should connect with, Charles Blass and George Poor, like they're interested in this collective intelligence phenomenon. And so like he's specifically making an introduction, like tagging me and like building that connection to elaborate further, like that we should connect with each other because that's like a connection he thought would be useful. And so how can we create for the kernel community, or even any community, broadly speaking, how can we create that kind of intentional mark? Like, you should meet this person, like that. None of that can be determined by an AI. So like, yeah, you can have an AI do like, text observations of you on Twitter and in LinkedIn and all of your social media platforms, whatever. So you can have that analyzed, but is it really going to match you up with people that you have common interests with, or is it going to just give you like some generic output? So I think that this concept of Stig people is creating these intentional marks on the human landscape, like explicitly marking someone to connect with other people, or because they are this type of person or have this kind of knowledge or interest or background. And the great thing about Stig people, like as far as going into, so here's just some more, like, are these the causes? Is the situation novel? So the situation is like, the opportunity, I think, is novel for humans to kind of curate that like relationship tailoring that might be done in a lot of ways by AI. Like if you're on LinkedIn, oh, you might also know this other person. Like there's constantly recommendation algorithms, like just like the shopping algorithms. If you bought this, you might also buy that. Or if you know this person, you may also know that person. But those are generic recommendations and not specifically tailored to form connections, right? And so what if we like, so these kind of are limited, and the limitedness or limited scope of these current like markings on people, or current like forged relationships by the internet, these are not open marks. Like even Twitter, like you can't mark someone like you should meet this person because they're also interested in collective intelligence. You can't form a Stigmergic mark like that in Twitter or LinkedIn or in any like current social media landscape. So they're not open, they're not extensible, and the affordances for marking people are not open also. Like you can use emoji, right, to mark a comment, a URL, happy face, sad face, thumbs up, thumbs down. I think there's like, I don't know, maybe close to 750, maybe pushing 1,000 emojis out there now. But like none of those emojis are going to, tell you what is in the content of the URL, unless we like have an emoji definition. And even so, like there's way more than 1,000 concepts or topics that we want to talk about. And so we, could potentially create the affordance to have very open, broad the types of Stigmergic marks and higher fidelity data. And then this creates like tons of opportunity for emergent potential. I already talked about online dating and how we wasted a lot of time doing that before, you could just leave some Stigmergic trail and cut a lot of that stuff out. So the mission of this project, we're going to explore the possibilities for facilitating connection and coordination through human Stigmergy. We will explore implicit marks left in the digital landscape on social media and other sites that are curated by humans. So we can, curate these AI data. And then also intentional marks left on humans by humans, which is like the type of mark I mentioned earlier, like with Andy introducing people in Slack, or other types of marks. And so like this is really kind of open. And one of the big questions that we have and would like to put out there for you guys is like, should these be graphical representations? Should they be topics? Should they be lists? How should we present these kinds of Stigmergic data in a way that would be implemented by the Kernel community or any community? And so really we want to use Kernel as our kind of test subject or pilot project, because it's obviously like we're here and we have access to all these wonderful fellows that hopefully would play with us in our Kernel adventure and could mark each other. And I think that this would really maybe benefit the Kernel community. But where should we leave these marks so that people will use them? That's one thing. Should they be Web3? Like when not everyone in Kernel is maybe fluent in Web3? Should they be Web2 with like Web3 access, Web3 governance? That's another possibility. And what are the types of marks? Like, should they be in a graph database? What do you guys think would be used by the community the most, what would provide the most benefit to everyone. And so like, how can you, what would you like to see in a way to connect with other fellows? Like, would you like to see lists of people by topic or by interest, or potentially like you find someone you really like and look at all the people that they're connected to, or how would you like to see these data presented in a way that's easy to work with, that you might use to build new connections? And then how will we measure those connections? So that's another like hard thing for the paper. So this is kind of, we want to do this with Kernel. We want to take metrics like to see, is it working? Are people building new connections based on the data that we're providing? And are people marking each other? So if it's not easy to work with, nobody's going to use it. And we know that. And so we talked about implicit marks, explicit marks. And then there's what are the tools that we need, what opportunities, what expertise, what are the risks? So the biggest risk, like I said, is that people won't interact with the data or won't stigmergically mark each other because it's a pain in the butt. So we want that to be the easiest and most user-friendly part of this project. So I think, and this is just the milestones, just to go through the catechism and show you guys the rest of how it looks. Implications, logistics, communication. So there's just a lot of questions here. The catechism is, how is the project going to unfold? I'm going to stop sharing and pass this back to Brad to maybe touch on some things that I didn't cover, or wrap it up and put it forward into the open conversation part.
Thanks a million, Blue. Yeah, the catechism thing, just to give you an example, I did one pass on it, right? I just answered the questions as best I could. And, you know, some of them were half-assed, and then Blue came in and like she did a pass, and voila, there. I mean, it's not done, but it's like, it's pretty far along, and it didn't require a lot of like debate about what format should it be and all that. So that's a big part of the catechism, is just like, don't have to, you know, it's sort of a tool to kind of guide you along. So yeah, I'm going to do a couple more minutes here and then just kind of open it up into, you know, whatever we want to talk about. Oops. Why is my signal? Where's my, sorry. Did I almost make it? Let's try it again here. Oh, I know why. Okay. I want to share. Hopefully.
Is there any magic solution to Windows management, really?
Okay. And hopefully, can you guys see the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so the origins of this project, real quickly, I've been working around trust networks for a long time, and, you know, particularly around the power of trust networks for collective decisioning. And I think that's one of the big possible outcomes of this. But one of the questions is, where do these trust edges come from? I mean, you can derive them from things like, well, if someone retweets someone a lot, then they probably trust them on some level, or they're kind of delegating their attention to them. And so you can implicitly derive these trust edges, but ultimately you really want it to be something that truly represents what we know about each other. And, you know, there's so many examples of, you know, Andy introduced, like, you know, we use that over and over. Andy knows this person has a lot in common with this other person, or this person is really knowledgeable about some arcane subject. So how do we capture that in a way that's meaningful and fun, and, you know, not a chore, but natural. And also, you know, when we talked about this the other day with Andy, he brought up an important point. It's not a purely free action for Andy to say this person is important, right? Because that's something that is internal to him, and he doesn't waste it. So there's a lot of really interesting, you know, sort of subtleties about this. But it does seem to us that this is a great opportunity for like an open data commons, that if we can somehow capture meaningful knowledge about each other in a crawlable, machine readable form, we can start doing things we're not doing now. So we're sort of trying to keep it simple. We're just boiling it down to humans marking humans, and how do we do that? My approach to this up until now, and this is totally up to discussion, is that one of these actions is an edge in a graph. A marks B, right? In the implementations that we've been doing with OrangoDB, a graph database, an edge has a source and a target, and it also has type, weight, and metadata, right? And so the type, there's lots of ways of dealing with this, but the type could be the verb. This is an invitation. This is an amplification. This is an introduction. And then the weight, I see it, as a floating point vector that like for instance, if this is a trust edge or a respect edge, I respect this person a lot in this domain, or I trust my daughter to feed the dog, but I don't trust her to fly an airplane. Edges, thinking about, so one of the big questions is, how do we do this in Web3, right? And I started looking at semantic triple stores as a model, and we don't want to reinvent any wheels there. From the research I've been doing, there are no great performant representations of semantic triple stores on chain yet. And there's that link there is pretty interesting to talk about why not. So that's one area of discussion. And so, yeah, just to seed some conversation here, a couple of things that we want to hear from people is, what tools do we want to, try out in doing this? The Discord work that DAO Gardens people have been doing is a good start. We could easily write a Slack bot that just does simple marking in Slack. So /introduce, blah, blah, to blah, blah, or /amplify so-and-so. Question then becomes, where does it go? Web3 implementation, I'm super interested in any ideas that people have about the various options like Lens protocol, et cetera. What's the language of marking? Like what are the kinds of things that we would want to include in our vocabulary? How do tokens fit into this? What identifiers do we use when we're marking people? Privacy, et cetera. And then outcomes. I mean, this is a lot more than we're going to get in the next however many minutes we have. But those are the just kind of general areas. And the GDoc has a lot of these in there. I'll leave it there and just kind of open it up to what, did I stop that share? No, I didn't. There we go. Yeah, so anybody who has any questions or thoughts, I haven't been able to monitor the chat up until now, but there's probably some good questions in there. Anybody have any particular things they want to drive at?
I've got something, Brad, that might be useful. Would it be helpful to just talk a little bit about how the Token Engineering Commons is thinking about using this work that the DAO Gardens folks, Common Sense folks have been doing?
Sure.
So, so one thing that I also want to highlight about the work that ronen and Shahar have been doing that's pretty cool, actually, is that Discord forum that you saw that when Shahar was demoing, one of the things that's kind of cool about that is that so that's a new feature in Discord. The forum is a new feature, and you can categorize posts by various topics. And so that's kind of interesting. We're looking at that as like maybe a way of doing just a high level, kind of like categorization scheme that then we might be able to break out. If we see like one category is kind of breaking out and having a lot of attention, then we could then drop it down and run another forum in another place in our Discord server, and then have that kind of like have more detailed categories, right? So you could get this kind of nice evolution of topics that's organic. And the way that they've implemented this with the Airtable now, they just shifted over to this. It's kind of cool because we'll be able to track what the channel is in Discord. And so we'll be able to mark whether somebody is maybe interested in the ethics aspects of token engineering. And that's the place where they're posting stuff. And even one of the things that's most interesting is that the way this is implemented, or will soon be implemented, is it will be able to run on multiple Discord servers. So there's kind of an interesting opportunity to kind of integrate servers and think of this more as people, rather than people in an organization. And that's the thing that we're really interested in the Token Engineering Commons, is this idea that, as we move into this next phase of the web, people are people. They're not just like members of an organization, and finding ways to be able to track them across organizations and make those introductions between people and the links that they have, the shared interests that they have, independent of their organization. That's really cool. I mean, that's really revolutionary, I think. And so so I think there's a lot of potential here. That's why we're so excited about this project. And it may be just worth mentioning too that we're looking at kind of like one possibility for tokenizing this is to have that database that you saw basically be token gated, so that people would need to be, there might be like some free versions of that, but as a way to make it easy to for partners to participate in this, allow them to participate with the token, the TEC token, as a way to kind of like token gate access to that content. So there's still a lot that we're working through. There's still like both just within the TEC, but also working with these guys. So there's still, it's kind of early days, but it's pretty exciting, I think.
Charles, it looks like you got
just a super quick question, Gideon, about the multiple Discord servers thing. I just got this great flash and I wasn't sure, but that means you can kind of literally select certain ones and filter and so on. That's the idea with that? Super. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, so one, thank you for convening all these folks. This is wonderful, and I think I've been hoping for something like this to come together. So, man, this is great. I'll give you a little background on some of the stuff we're building at the meme, mem.wtf. The way that we think about some of the stuff, and I think it interfaces pretty well here, is like, how do we allow communities to create their own agreements that they own, that define the relationships between their members and their members to digital objects, and then plug that into dApps across the ecosystem that then respect within that contract to be those that hold kind of these token enabled roles that have specific rights and responsibilities and economics associated with them. And so I think about something like this being an amazing extension of that for, as we think about something like the kernel library or others, like we're seeing many of the same patterns as to how there might be different roles for collaborative publishing, kind of more broadly. This kind of really base primitive as to how do we agree together on what our social facts are of an organization. And that can look like a collaborative newsletter of like, how do we tell the stories of a community, and everybody, who gets to propose that something goes on record, who gets to play an editorial role of with some logic amongst other members of seeing whether or not that meets the criteria for that community to go on that record, and then maybe more kind of publisher roles of determining who has those roles, who can contribute, who can edit, in what ways, who can read this, who accesses these things. And so the idea is, how do we allow folks to create their own agreements this way that are between those humans that then are respected across the ecosystem? So I can see lots of ways, and we have lots of use cases that we can think about of how this might plug in, of how do you use these reactions, these votes, and amongst, especially as you can kind of think about different members potentially playing different roles of what those votes mean, what those contributions might mean, and then how do we decide together based on an agreement we have at community level, not necessarily globally, but within kernel, say, how does kernel curate its own library, right? Like who gets to propose? Everybody can propose within kernel, say, but how do we decide what goes in the library? What does that look like? And so there might be different catalogs that we choose different cards to go into, but we can start thinking about what are those different pieces of media. Same thing of how do we curate a collective calendar, right? Like what goes on the calendar of an organization. So these are all folks that we've been working with across these use cases, like Oakland, for instance, has oak.community. We're trying to think about how to onboard all Oaklanders into Web3 in some way. And we think events is going to be a core way to do this. And how do we start organizing kind of a collective calendar for Oakland? I would love to figure out how we use some of this same language that we can all use across. How are we all curating our community's media into our shared record is the way that we think about it. And I think this is a very useful tool for how we plug a bunch of those pieces together. So yeah, I'm really excited to dig in and kind of start going through some of those use cases and thinking about how might we do this more collaborative publishing use cases using these kind of structures.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way I've been thinking about it is any sort of self-identified sub-network, community, club, whatever terminology you want, is kind of like a decentralized editorial board, right? When Kernel is sharing links all over the place. Common Sense Makers, there's links being shared in Discord. These are all we're kind of these are collectively curating collections of URLs, and so. These tools, I think, can make it much easier to kind of distill the zeitgeist and the best out of that kind of activity, get it better organized so it's not all over the place, make it publishable, make it further curatable. So yeah, I think thinking of it as editorial boards is one way to kind of conceptualize it.
I might take that even one more step, which is, I think these same patterns. So certainly like editorial boards, like thinking about the New York Times and what they've done for their historic record of how we've used this process to know that, we can look back at 1980 or 1895 or any of these things and know that there's this kind of same process for what goes into the New York Times record. I think then extending that beyond, like, it turns out like everything's a decentralized media organization. Like how does a restaurant choose what dish goes on its menu? There's different decision makers in that process. They have different logic for what that looks like. There's a lot of it that's implicit, not explicit, but it's that same pattern. Or how Nouns chooses what grants get funded by the Nouns DAO, or how foundations choose how they fund their grants. You can imagine in a similar structures. There's grantees proposing grants to be funded. There's some decision-making process that's agreed on by that community. But I think the more we can orient it towards a community has an agreement amongst themselves as to how they're going to process what goes on their record and what that means, and not at the global level. So I think, golden.xyz is a great example of, like, I think that can be a specific pattern, or even Wikipedia. What is notable on Wikipedia is specific to Wikipedians, and what meets that threshold, that might look really different for different communities. And I think the more that we can allow communities to manage their own agreements among their members, and then have the software serve those agreements, that charter that they have together, and have that done in code, I think that is just a really, really powerful primitive for us to start building on top of. That goes well beyond kind of how we think about media and newsletters. It definitely extends, but I think that's a great place to start effectively. You're on mute, Brad.
Yeah, like the science domain is a perfect example where there's like lots of people who have domain expertise and shared domain expertise and respect for each other, and there's a lot of knowledge that could be much better aggregated, curated, distilled, etc., and published out. One thing I'd like to just sort of inquire about is, like, if anybody has any knowledge or particular opinions. I'll let you go first, Ronen, but I'd like to know about any. I mean, we're sort of looking at Lens Protocol and others. I mean, and maybe Ronen, you can talk about Common Sense Protocol, but how can we represent this stuff practically today so that we can experiment with it?
That's so. I'll talk about that, and I also wanted to raise another kind of point that came up in the chat. Where to represent this is something we're kind of learning on the fly, like trying to understand these different Web3 social media protocols, and which could be adapted for our use case. I think what you said about the semantic triple store is really Web3 storage of those triples is like one of the key aspects that we're going to probably want to crack, both for the people marking and for the content marking. We've seen a few efforts like focus on, I think, IPFS, ceramic is like, can be a Web3 graph database, essentially, like distributed graph database. So yeah, IPFS, ceramic, and then some kind of digital decentralized identity. So index is one. I put that on my slides. I also link it in the document. Yeah, I'm trying to set up a meeting with them. So they've already built something like this for indexing simple like URLs using Web3 protocols. So yeah, I think this is something we're kind of, I think, gonna need to sort of work through. This is like one of the big questions right now online. Just one other thing I wanted to mention, kind of a framing that kind of came to me as Blue, you were presenting, was just this idea of, something occurred to me that it sounds a lot like LinkedIn endorsements, at least part of what the Stig people, kind of goals are. And it also iterating what Gideon was saying, like I think that could be a really cool sort of replacement for things like LinkedIn, like, because no one uses actually that, but I can see how it would be really useful in the right kind of setting. But yeah, I mean, are you thinking of it are you thinking of it like along those lines, or is that completely off? Like, just trying to figure out if my mental model is anywhere near yours.
So like, it could be anything. I wasn't really thinking like a LinkedIn endorsement. I guess an endorsement would be right, like not necessarily a recommendation. But the difference is that like the endorsements are open, and they're not like limited to some list of skills that that I necessarily put on there. So it could be this. Would that be a useful thing? I don't know. And then like also in LinkedIn is like a giant list of endorsements that anybody can look at my profile and see, right? And so the idea here, I think that there are some real privacy concerns with having like a list of things that people say about me open and viewable to anyone. But like this inter-community kind of endorsement or skill list might be very helpful, especially like in regards to a place like Kernel. It gives you a good idea of what all the different people are interested in, and what they would like to study about, and these kinds of things. So how do you make like a community specific endorsement list? Maybe that might be a good way, but also like that's not necessarily easily translatable to nodes and edges in a graph database. And so can we reconcile those two things? Which is easier to work with? I'm not really sure.
Well, in one respect, just like person A sort of then edge with some kind of label, person B would be some kind of like representation of a simple endorsement.
You can use like some cryptography to hash stuff, so it won't be like visible outside the community. I guess there's many like different mechanisms we can use to ensure that.
Yeah, and I think Glenn's point about clubs and how each community has its own kind of rules that it can establish and actually, memorialize and formalize is a really good one. I generally think of like, I own my marks, right? And you own your marks, and I can make any of those marks as public or as private as I want. And then we can, collectively do that as a community. I tend to want to go for open as much as possible at the beginning, because I think that's where there's a lot of shared value, and it's a useful commons. But obviously, people, who collectively, work together or gather in some way, want to have control over, who participates and how. Philip, do you want to maybe express your questions about the sort of how these networks kind of federate or overlap or differentiate?
I think he said he might have been eating, so I don't know if he's
sorry.
Still muted.
Yeah, I was, but I think I've just finished the bowl, so perfect timing. Sorry, I was trying to put my food away without it tipping down my top and unmute. What was the question?
Oh, just, sort of some of the questions that were going on in the chat about how do these sort of these subnetworks or groups or communities kind of federate or live in a shared space?
So just to qualify the way I'm coming at this, I've just had the privilege of spending 4 years researching identity in the context of digital mediation. And that's different to digital identity. I'm talking about the digital mediation and augmentation of human identity. Why am I going on about that in this conversation? That's because social scientists, in fact, actually every discipline that's not called law or computer science considers human identity as sort of a capacity for and a process of sense and meaning making, which is therefore incredibly relevant to the topic at hand. So when you frame human identity in that particular context, it's important to understand the psychological ramifications of the cybernetic information flows, the feedback loops that are essential to our living processes that are now digitally mediated, because they have psychological impact. So perhaps if I was going to boil my work down heuristically, I would say, for example, that we need more friction in the system, not less. When you take all the friction out and suddenly you have one social graph, even if that social graph consists of 3 million interoperable social graphs, at some point it's monolithic because there's no friction in the way for that information to flow in any which way that anyone with access to the resulting information. It's too much. It has effects that social scientists call de-individuation, which is where you start behaving as a mob rule, or disindividuation, where you feel like you're losing your individuality and you've got to now play up in the same way that we see in the selfie generation, poor bastards. I mean, Christ, I'm glad I wasn't born that late. So we have to be very careful. What we're very much used to, we've evolved to cope with, as we all know, Dunbar's number, hundreds to 200 relationships. And perhaps I think digital might do wonders for just extending it an extra loop, where the nexus is the relationships involved, very much edge-centric. But if we start allowing this interoperability according to the original schema, the original thesis for the semantic web, to just extend ad infinitum, it's not good news in terms of our self-narratives, the way we make sense of the world. It's just too much. It's just, we just feel like a number, like a small cog in a big machine. It doesn't allow the mind to do what the mind is best doing. This new system we build is not legacy compatible, because actually the legacy system unusually was far more capable than this new datafication of society, but it pollutes the information ecology that's essential to the cognitive processes. So I'm just in case I'm still struggling to articulate my work, so apologies if that just sounded
Well, actually, listening to the identity jam stuff has kind of moved me more towards differentiating identifier from identity, right? Like A marks B, you know, when I'm saying I want to amplify this person, well, that person is an @ name, and you know, and I know that @ name is who they are, right? And so what do we use as an identifier so that I can mark them in a way that's meaningful to me, meaningful to them, meaningful to others, as opposed to saying, you know, their identity. It's more like a pointer, and I think that's important. That helps at least, you know, decomplexify what we mean by saying I'm operating on that other person. I mean, for me, I'm happy.
Just to be clear, I just want to reverse everything you just said, actually. I want to complexify it. There is insufficient variety in what we're designing here. So identifier, to your point, is absolutely bang on. Identifier and identity are quite distinct things, even pre-digital. And so actually, if we start marking identifiers rather than interacting with identities as we have evolved to do, then that contributes to the problem I've just tried but rather badly to describe. So I don't want my understanding of Brad to be a universal identifier, because my understanding of you is different to your family's. It's different to Ronen, and you guys have worked longer, so Ronen's got a different, perhaps deeper, more sophisticated understanding of what you're about, and how you can do great things together than you and I do, because we've only interacted on 3 or 4 occasions. So this is about me making sense, bringing the amazing capacity of our collective mind to bear, a mind that I want to see if we can assist rather than replace, and that assistance requires that we build frictions in. So in other words, we work very much counter to the semantic web's thesis of all data should be universally meaningful in exactly the same way. Like, Christ, as if any linguistic expert would agree with that shit. I mean, it's just only a computer scientist could come up with that way of looking at the world. So
yeah, I'm thinking of it more from a Gall's law kind of practical sense of like, okay, let's say we wanted to generalize what's being done with DAO Gardens to include Slack and Twitter, right? Because I would rather not have to look to search for URLs in all 3 domains, right? And how do we do that? I'm perfectly happy to say, well, this Slack account and this Discord account and this Twitter account are mine, and I'm happy to kind of create a decentralized identifier based on that, and then just say, okay, whenever anybody wants to include me in anybody wants to mark me, use this identifier, right?
And that's absolutely perfectly rational, and that's the problem. Because Alice and the other 8 billion people will, given the opportunity, self-triangulate, self-correlate, collapse their different contextual self-narratives down to one singular narrative that can be machined. And once you then are reliant on a machine to do it rather than humans, you have undermined the processes of human identity and, in fact, the very cognitive essence that defines our species.
Ray, you've got your hand up, and then Ronen.
Yes, so thank you, Philip, for making that important distinction between identifiers and identity. And I want to tie that to a question that Blue asked about. So how should we display all this Stigmergy info? And the answer is, I think, in what we normally do anyway, as social creatures. Like, we figure out that we have some objective and we're trying to figure out who we want to meet. And so there's this question of, if there's all this identifiers around an enormous number of people, well, how do we filter that down? Because to Philip's point, we don't actually want to see, thousands or even hundreds of people that meet certain criteria. We have particular social objectives that we want to find people maybe like who are in a particular topic, but maybe we also want people in the same time zone. Maybe we even want an individual in the same part of the world that we could easily meet with. Maybe we want someone who has no connections to our social graph because we're looking to try to find information that we can't get from all the people that we know already. Maybe we want to find someone who has multiple connections to our existing social graph because we care about the reputation of this person that we're considering reaching out to. And so that means that we use our cognitive processes to filter that out and decide, okay, do I want people only in the same time zone or in the same country, or that do I need them to have this interest in common, or do they have to have these 3 interests in common? And that should be something that a person can play with on demand to narrow it down according to their context, because we have a lot of social intuitions about exactly what we're trying to do in a relationship when we reach out to someone, and that is a way to really narrow it down and keep it within that Dunbar's number of like, okay, so how many people can we really deal with, and how do we not get overwhelmed by a technology saying, you know, here's 3,000 people that meet your search criteria.
Thanks, Ray.
Quick response on that, Ray, and then Renee, you're next. I think that's the idea behind making this open source, is that right now you can do all that stuff in LinkedIn, right? I mean, you can search for people by location, by how many hops they are from you, or all that stuff. So by making this similar data more open source, then anybody can write any algorithm they want for searching, filtering, etc. Renan?
So just to come back very briefly on Ray's suggestion there, I think what I'd ask you to do is ask yourself why you love Kernel. And if you turned up to Kernel and it was 2030, and now there's just this amazing digital interface that just does most of it for you. So I'd love to design a system that does, in fact, actually, as you were talking, I was thinking of at Crypto Wanderer, not that we'd want to replace him with code, God forbid, but in terms of his super connecting capabilities, for example, he just says, oh, hey, Philip, you should speak to Glenn. And of course you do. But what he doesn't know is 8 billion people, right? He just goes so far, a little bit further than most of us, because he's a super connector rather than just a normal connector. So I want our technology to be able to do that sort of thing, but then stop. Please stop, because that's human.
Renan, or did you go already?
Yeah, no, yeah, this is really interesting. I love what you said now, Philip, about sort of this kind of technology that's sort of respectful of the boundaries of like human cognition and like sense-making capabilities. And I think that kind of ties into, this is what Brad and I have been talking about, you know, this kind of, we can do that, but we kind of need, like, we need to be able to build the algorithms to do that, and we need to have the data open to do that. So I could imagine there'd be a class, like once the data is open, there would be a whole, like there'd be some algorithms that are like trying to connect you with 8 billion people and you wouldn't want to use them. But then there would be others built by, you know, people that are sort of more mindful of these kind of cognitive boundaries, that they would be building these kind of things. So I don't think we can stem the tide for people that are trying to build that one that's trying to connect you to the whole world. And I agree with you, like there's so many like, yeah, applications there that we don't want to see happen, but I mean, they're already happening right now with like social media in its current form. So just allowing those better options to be built, I think is kind of, that's how I think of it. And I also am, I also wanted to connect to some earlier things people said about this idea of like the friction. I'm wondering if friction in your minds would be like related to this idea of just, because it's sort of inside a community, like a community is already bounded. It's not like, you're not going to meet, like Kernel has whatever, how many 100 or 1,000 people in it. So there is kind of friction in just like allowing communities to sort of manage themselves and not explode to like be in touch with the whole world, and there's sort of their boundaries between communities. And somehow that would maybe also make the problem a little more friendly to, yeah, to humans.
Can I just come back on your first point, Ronan? And I've genuinely, I don't want to sound preachy. If I sound preachy, just mute me or something. But we know Alice will do this because of self-interest. Even if the self-interest isn't in the system interest, she will do it. And then the system interest won't serve her self-interest. And so saying, look, we know some people will use the tech we're building to actually do the dystopia, but hopefully there'll be others who use it more sensibly because they'll have a conversation like this, is an ethical fail.
Yeah, no, I did not want to do that. Like I'm very mindful of that failure mode, and I did not want to do that. Okay, yeah, I mean, one other way to say it is like right now right now the technology is failing. It's like the technology we have currently is failing. So by not doing anything, we're also failing. And then there's another question: are we able to even build technology like I think this approach of plurality, right? That's kind of what I was trying to channel, the approach of plurality, where you have a lot of different options that are available. Like we have to let a lot of different things happen because we don't really know the right ones. So that's kind of what I was trying to channel. And then, yeah, saying some of those options will be good, some of them will be bad, but at least there'll be the chance for the good ones to come to light, which currently can't happen because the data is closed.
Ryan and then Glenn.
Hey guys, this is awesome. I don't know where to start. I guess I'll say it like this. So for the better part of the last 8 months or so, I've been really deeply thinking about this as part of the Arweave Open Web Foundry and figuring out these, I don't want to say figuring out, but in pursuit of figuring out how do you build this system in a decentralized open source way to give people agency over their self-identified interests and creating tokenomics and having it be open sourced and it's hyperstructure and a way that's a public good and non-speculative and trying to like come up with the perfect system. And I got pretty close, but I am not God. And I realized that I am not God in my kernel experience. And what I am beginning or have been since day one and during my kernel experience, and I love you, Philip, and I hate you at the same time because you completely jacked me up. But I'm unlearning and unpacking a lot of these things that from a systems design technical standpoint can work, can be tokenized, can do all this stuff, check off all these boxes. But now I'm questioning everything. I just want to paint a little picture. So, and I'll say a side note. In kind of being this Arweave, which is like the perma-web data that's out there indefinitely forever, it's like I spent a long time like in this headspace of trying to think from a technology standpoint, what does this stuff look like 50 years from now, 100 years from now, right? Which is really crazy to do. But if you spend a half year in that headspace with a bunch of other people that are also thinking 100 years out, it messes with you. But what I didn't think about or didn't respect or didn't have the awareness to look at outside of my own perspective was the social side of these things. So the only way I can project 100 years out on the social side of things is look to the past. So if we imagine Web 1 as this open architecture, Web 2 emerges out of that to commercialize this architecture. The majority of all Web 2 comes down to advertising, right? And you look at all the money that's spent on advertising and political stuff. It's like it's basically the besides like the spend on war. It is a war. It's an info war, right? So my point is that with Web 2 and this ecosystem and market mechanics based on advertising, we were told the lie. The creative economy, the lie was that, oh, just give us your agency and let us the platform give you the tools to be able to express yourself, whether that's writing on Facebook or music on Spotify or even something like a Patreon, which, side note, started as an artist first thing with good intentions, got VC funded, and now that's completely out of the dude that started its hands because now he has to build something for his VCs that only have a 10-year horizon. My point is that in the Web 2 marketplace, when the incentives that we have is to make 0.0005% on a song or a video or whatever, we kill each other to make that 5%. And we're doing that and understanding that the platforms are making 99% of the money, but we kill each other, we kill ourselves to dance on TikTok and all this kind of stuff so that we can make that 0.005% of money. If you look at this in the future, or by looking at this in the future, and you say in these best case scenarios, like if this is open source, if this is this, if this is modular, if this is this, if this is that, there's two ways that this goes. In my mind, you have the open internet on public ledgers the contextualization and sense making of identity being AI driven, which isn't going to get very far, but that's what's already happening right now. You have protocols doing that, the sense making of ledgers via AI, and thus like figuring out who Philip is or who Ray is from an AI context based on ledger data of wallets. That's frightening. A better case, and what I was spending my time on is like, all right, if it's your self-identified interests and you're building a network of self-identified interests and connecting to other people's interests and building this web of contextualized, personalized interest and blah, 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 blah. What could potentially happen with that is that if this incentive there is to be able to control that, and that is open sourced. Philip's question of like, what's the difference between a network of 1,000 people versus a network of 1 million people? Like the same fundamental thing will happen, and that is that everybody has the opportunity to become their own Google. Everybody, whether it's a protocol or a person, by all the stuff being open, has the ability to create their own social graphs and thus become their own Google. But which is kind of cool and kind of nice. But the downside of that is now everybody has the opportunity to contextualize identity for anybody without that person's control. So it's hard for me to even describe. This is like what's been keeping me up at night, but it's a big problem. And you have to kind of look at this of like, all right, these things that we're developing, what does this look like 100 years from now? And I completely side with and agree with everything that everybody said so far. And it's like, we can't do nothing because we are the people that are coming together that have shared, I would say, language and morals and ethics that we want to build an open and loving internet and all this kind of stuff. So we have to do something. The question is what? I would just encourage us, and I'm preaching to myself because a couple months ago, I turned down VC money because I had this hunch that there wasn't something right about this, and thank God I did it. And it's because there's way bigger questions to be asking when it's not just like, oh, what does this look like in Web3, or how can we do this in Web3? It's like, all right, by doing it in Web3 opens up a lot of infinite holes that are very hard to get out of. The longer that this goes on. So I think like the people in this room are like the exact people that can be asking these tough questions, but trying to have this perspective, like the social perspective of like, all right, what are these things that we're dug in on, have spent personal time researching, studying, whatever, that we're very fluent in? How do we like take the opposite perspective of these things that we know a lot about or whatever? And understanding that opposite perspective at scale compounded, like could have either be our saving grace or the malicious thing that 50 years from now we're all just like, what did we do? Not to be all like crazy, but honestly, it's like these are the hard questions I'm asking myself. Kind of understanding like, all right, this is what we would have to do from a technology standpoint to do all this stuff. Yes, it's possible with the technology we have now to be able to do all the stuff that we're talking about, but should we do it? And how do we kind of come up with these little minimum viable points of trust to like edge out there? But yeah, I don't know.
I'll take that as a good segue. Glenn, I'll hand it to you. We're coming up on 90 minutes. I'm happy to stick around. This is a good conversation. I got nothing better to do. So anybody who wants to keep talking, just to kind of take what you've just said, Ryan, I would say, we're going to work on this paper, and the whole point of a paper is intellectual underpinning for these ideas. So anybody who wants to contribute to the paper, or at least be part of the process, that might be one way of going forward, is just kind of, just using that process to kind of answer some of these questions, or at least dig into them. So anyway, Glenn, and then anybody who needs to pop off, go ahead, but we can stick around as long as anybody wants to talk. And Andy, you just have something?
I'll just slide in quickly before Glenn. Sorry, I don't mean to, but I need to drop. And just to say that a lot of the conversation tonight, my time, has reminded me, one of the people who thinks along these lines that Daniel has had on his active inference. And can I just say, I have about I'm not even joking, about 12 active inference live streams lined up in my browser that I still need to get to because they're so good. But John Favicki came on and had a really, really interesting discussion. And, it's one that I've returned to, in fact. And the reason I bring up John is that he has these different notions of knowledge. There are four broad categories of knowledge. There's the propositional, right, which is like the collection of links into editorial boards or something like them. Propositional knowledge, stuff that you can read and learn about these propositions, about, epistemology, right? It's knowledge about things. Then you have the procedural. So this is like in the case of like DAO gardens, this kind of stuff. It's like you need to know what to do in order to work. So you need to know how to work Discord. You need to know how to work Slack. You need to know how to hit a hammer against a piece of metal to smith it. Procedural knowledge is knowledge of actions. And on that note, it's really interesting to me to think about the environment in which that's taking place, because ants leaving marks on a open piece of land is somewhat different than our marks coming from Discord and Slack and going into Airtable. And then after procedural, you have, and not after because they're not hierarchical, you have propositional, procedural, perspectival, right? And that seems to me, Brad, where you're kind of wanting to go is it's not just the propositions contained in these lists of links that people are sharing or the knowledge that is being curated and collected with any given community. It's a perspective. It's a way of seeing. It's not just epistemology, it's ontology, right? It's the way of seeing, it's the way of framing issues in general that allows us to develop a common language and have really meaningful discussions full of shibboleths and rich identities that Philip doesn't want you to reduce down to identifiers. And then the final one is participatory. It's like children playing in a sandbox. Right? You're actually participating in the thing. And it's not better than, you need all four of these different kinds of knowledge for holistic ecologies of information and wisdom, not just salience, but sapience, not just relevance, but rapture. And that kind of thing is it's interesting to note that framework and the way that John talks about it, to hear him talk about the necessity of coupling virtue with virtuosity, for instance, is Daniel's great gem that he pulled out of him. And just keeping that in mind as you think about framing the objectives of the stuff. I love what Bleu is talking about in terms of loving marks and machines of loving grace. It has overtones of that, right? But in this Gardenic form, which is nice. And just to stay focused on that is an interesting thing, because I don't think it's just about collecting a series of propositions. And I think that if you go after that, or even get stuck in the procedural stuff, you'll miss some of the potential of what's what this kind of thinking or this framework, this perspective can get you to, and the kinds of knowledge ecologies in which it can engender participation.
Yeah, that's great, Andy. Yeah, I mean, in general, I think the perspectival and the participatory are really what drives me. Is what is our collective sense of this, And yeah, Glenn, I think you're up.
Thanks, Andy, for that, because I think that's, just building off of what Ryan was saying, I think starting from Web 2 is often probably even comparing to LinkedIn or other things, is this idea that these marks we make are just out there to be interpreted in all these ways. And I think part of this is how do we find what is the context for your marks? What is the meaning that you're trying to make, right? And so like, and I think we have to think about each one of those. That's why I like the terminology votes a little bit more than marks, in some way that there's an intention behind this thing, and how do you understand what you're voting on? And I think part of that is like, what is it you've agreed for those marks to mean, right? And so I think if you start, rather than like, from the how do we solve this most broadly, but kind of go more specifically as like, what are the specific contexts with the specific agreements that we're trying to solve for? What are the things that we're trying to vote on? And that's why I think things like the kernel library, as an example, like what does it mean to recommend a book for the library, or to post the thing, and for someone to say, oh yeah, vote for that in the library, that's a book, or whatever it is, like that's a different, more specific context. We say, hey, within the environment of the people of kernel, in this space that we have this context for, this is what this mark means, and we can kind of go from there. And I think starting at some of the, or the venture capital case of like, how do we mark investors who we find to be of quality that I introduce people from kernel to, right? And I would love for us to be able to do that collectively, so that we can together manage a reputation, not just when in the moment we sell equity, and use whisper networks of like checking in with our other founder friends, is this person treated anybody shitty that like, well, is there a way for us to manage that together? But I think then there's the specificity of like, what are we agreeing to together for these marks to mean, so that and then we can kind of build those up in different ways, so that what the context is of the mark that you use, rather than us trying to, so I think we can come the other way too. There's lots of stuff that is happening in social media, and we can start lifting, interesting, things we imply from that, or whatever it is. But I think coming this other way, from an agreement amongst a community, and then how does that community want those marks to work, those votes to work, is a way that gets us out of some of the the things that Ryan was kind of posing, and that's the thing I worry about when we think about building on top of existing social, or even the folks that are building Web3 social networks that are pretty skeuomorphic to the ad models that we've had in terms of how we think about posts and follows and all these other things. And so I would rather we go the other way and say, what is a problem we are trying to solve amongst humans that we can use marks to participate in, to collectively do something together? And then as we have more of those use cases using the same framework that I think is a really good one, is like, how do we start assembling all those use cases? And now it's an open, open standard for folks to use, that can build off of, oh, what kind of media does your community want to curate in what ways? Great, then you can start, building into new ways. But at least that way it comes all from the intention and what has already been consented to voluntarily as to how we want those marks to make meaning.
Yeah, Glenn, let's definitely dig into, find an opportunity to kind of ways to plug clubs in, or, kind of, I want to dig into how clubs work, so that, we can incorporate that into this thinking, because it's definitely rich.
Yeah, we'd love that. Yeah.
Ryan, you got something?
No, I was just switching headphones. I'll say something really quickly. So we talked a lot about migrating Web 2 data to, I would say, to give us more agency and control over it, perhaps. There's a whole nother a lot of other things to explore once just talking about Web3 data in and of itself. If you're just thinking that, like, I'll say it like this: everything that has the opportunity to be better coordinated, in my opinion, will likely become tokenized in the future, whether that's scientific research papers or house, or it's like, in my mind, if Web3 works out, like, there'll be many things that will be tokenized in the future. And the data that's associated with, let's say, a research science paper, within that token, it's the Wild West right now. So I think there's a really huge problem and opportunity as far as coming up with open standards that addresses Web3 data and the contextualization of that beyond the Web 2 stuff. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the future or whatnot, but it's a different conversation, but totally plays into what we're talking about.
Cool. Well, might as well leave it there, I think. This has been a great conversation. Daniel says we can make a paper out of it.
Well, I mean, like, joke, no joke, and then we can have any final comments and then close the recording. But it's as easy as download as PDF, upload to Zenodo, get a DOI. It's like the gatekeeping of DOIs is over. Everyone can be a co-author with a PDF upload, and that can include pseudonyms and complex identities. And so we can start acting now how we want to precipitate the next steps. So awesome participation and contributions from everybody of all time zones. Farewell.
Thanks, everybody.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad.